So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this OFS event focusing on getting access and participation plans back on track. My name is Sarah Howells, and I'm the Head of Access and Participation here at the OFS, and so I oversee our work on access and participation plans. Before I get into the purpose of the event and introduce you to our speakers, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I need to quickly run through with you. The event is being recorded and the recording will be available on the OFS website later on this week. So if you have colleagues that you think would benefit from watching it, it will be there for you to see. Live captions or subtitles are available and can be accessed by clicking on the CC icon in Zoom. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our speakers, and you should submit questions using the Q&A function. Please do make sure that you use this function rather than the chat function to submit your questions. If you have any technical or logistical questions and would like to contact a member of the OFS events team during the event, then you should use the chat function. The chat function will only allow you to interact with the OFS team. Unfortunately, it won't allow you to interact with other delegates. And so to the purpose and shape of this session today, most universities and colleges submitted new access and participation plans to the OFS in the spring and summer of last year. And these were the first plans to be developed after the OFS reformed its approach to access and participation. The reforms enabled plans to be set over 5 years, allowing universities and colleges to take a far more strategic and ambitious approach to closing gaps in outcomes between different student groups. And the plans that came into us really didn't disappoint. We were excited to see the level of ambition, both in the targets that were set and in the approaches that universities and colleges were going to take to meet them. And if those targets are achieved, we will see a step change in the sector with respect to equality of opportunity. Now, the ongoing challenges of the pandemic have undoubtedly impacted on the delivery of some of those commitments set out in access and participation plans. But it's also demonstrated how important it is to continue to do the work we need to do as a sector to address gaps in access, success and progression. We know that particular groups of students have been harder hit by the pandemic than others. We know that existing vulnerabilities have been exacerbated and that new vulnerabilities have been created. There are clear concerns that as the virus exposes the unequal access to the tools needed to learn effectively in an online and blended world, certain groups will fall further behind. This is why we believe it's critical to get access and participation plans back on track so that we can do the work now to enable us to make progress on closing gaps between student groups. We've got a really great lineup of speakers for you today. I'll shortly ask Chris Millward, Director for Fair Access and Participation at the OFS, to provide us with his overview of where we are in respect of access and participation in the context of the pandemic and the broader political environment. He'll be followed by Elizabeth Garnham, who's our Access and Participation Plan Manager, who will go through our expectations of universities and colleges in respect of the monitoring of their 2019-2020 access and participation plans. And there'll then be some time for questions from you to put to both Chris and Elizabeth. There'll then be a short 5-minute break before we go to our second session, in which we'll hear from colleagues in universities and colleges on how they've addressed some of the challenges the pandemic has created at each stage of the student life cycle. So we'll hear from Mike Nicholson from the University of Bath, Louise Banaheen from the University of Leeds, Ellen Cocking from the Open University, and Megan Nichols from New College, Durham. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Chris Millward to kick us off with his keynote.
Okay, thanks Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope this is a really helpful and interesting session. Obviously interesting timing given announcements over the weekend in England, and we will of course want to reflect on the implications of those announcements as we develop our approach to monitoring and everything we're going to set out today. I wanted to start, as I have with every session like this over the last 6 months, to thanking you for all the work you've done over the last 6 months. It's of course particularly difficult to do that for many people working from home, working online, now of course supporting students through various forms of blended and online learning, and in a very uncertain environment, as we've seen over the weekend. There is great responsibility on universities and colleges to deliver learning and teaching and student support safely in the current environment, and to help students to achieve their best in really difficult conditions. But of course, if you reflect on the work that we're doing on access and participation, also to try to keep working with schools and colleges and with employers when they may well be focused on more immediate priorities. So no doubt, the announcements over the weekend will add to some of the challenges with all of that. We've seen over the summer how central higher education is to the ambitions and expectations of families throughout the country. I think that was really clear from the intensity of focus on admissions decisions in August, and now the focus on the experience of students who've entered university this year, or indeed are returning to university and college this year. And within that, I think we have seen a particular focus on fairness and equal opportunities for the most disadvantaged students. So essentially what we're all here talking about today in relation to access and participation. It is clear, as Sarah said already, that the lockdown in the spring hit the most disadvantaged people and communities the hardest. And I'm sure that further restrictions will to a degree compound that. But it is also clear to us that means it's more important than ever for us to keep access and participation work high on the priority list for universities and colleges, whilst we also take account of and learn from the experience of the last 6 months. We've been monitoring carefully the impact of the pandemic on access and participation, on learning and teaching, and indeed, of course, the specific groups of students that you're all supporting through your access and participation plans, right through from school to higher education, and indeed beyond graduation. Some of you will have been involved in roundtables that we held with students and the sector and third sector partners in the August. You might also have seen the findings from the polling we commissioned over the summer, and which we're going to repeat during the coming weeks and months. The insights we've had from that have influenced what we're going to talk about today in terms of our approach to monitoring, and indeed our broader approach to regulating and funding access and participation into the future. Admissions data this year looks positive. I think we've seen an increase overall in UK placed applicants, and indeed the highest proportionate increases among the students from the lowest participation groups, and indeed in the universities where it has traditionally been the hardest for those students to get into. So we have seen a 22% increase in students from quintile 1 entering the highest tariff providers. We've also seen increases this year in mature student participation, so the first year for some time, I think 10% for over 24-year-olds, and indeed important increases in areas like nursing and allied health professionals, which are up 15%, being a key part of that. So we are seeing high levels of higher education participation, particularly among the groups we're targeting through our access and participation work, in universities that are often the furthest to travel, have the furthest to travel on access, and in areas that are really crucial to local and national prosperity. And indeed the early data, I think, on admissions for next year looks like that we will continue the momentum on all of that. Alongside that positive picture, of course, there are real challenges. So there are, as you're all, I'm sure, experiencing, the academic and practical challenges of supporting students who are entering higher education following a period without learning in many cases. And of course, the longer term impact the pandemic will have on educational inequality. And we've seen that from the rapid evidence gathering by people like the Education Endowment Foundation, work that was published by LSE last week on the impact on young people. It's clear across the board that greater vulnerability to coronavirus and the effect on the most disadvantaged parts of the country has limited the ability of students at all levels to engage with learning, and that of course will have an impact on some of the things we're trying to achieve over time. Alongside that, we are seeing great examples of universities and colleges and outreach partnerships that we fund finding new ways of working with students in schools and colleges, and indeed new ways of working with employers, as we'll hear about later on. We've tried to share that through briefings we published during lockdown and by continuing to update case studies to support the sector on this. We're also seeing that by using those modes, some activities can become more accessible and they can extend their reach. But alongside that, and the polling is very clear on this, there are real challenges associated with online learning in relation to hardware and software, connectivity and support, and above all, space to work. And that affects some groups of students. Students with disabilities are a really good example of that, more than others. Since March, OFS has really tried to boil down its regulation and its funding to deal with what we thought were the three most important things during the period of the pandemic. So firstly, the quality of learning and teaching. Secondly, the financial health of universities and colleges. And thirdly, perhaps particularly relevant to everything we'll discuss today, support for the most disadvantaged and vulnerable students. That last issue, that third issue, has in part been delivered by us continuing to provide funding. So we have continued to fund UniConnect partnerships and work with them to change their modes of working. We've continued to fund the TASO What Work Centre. We've continued to provide a student premium to universities and colleges. And indeed, we've invested in an emergency student mental health service called Student Space. But alongside that, I think we need to recognise that actually the majority of the activity on access and participation happens not through our funding, but through the commitments you all make through your access and participation plans, which is really what we're going to talk about today. In relation to that, we made clear in March that financial commitments to students must be honoured, but we have allowed greater flexibility since then so that planned investment could be moved from activities that couldn't happen, for example, direct face-to-face engagement with schools, to more immediate needs, for example, student hardship, the provision of digital resources, and broader issues of student well-being. We said that we expected you and your governing bodies to make reasonable judgments about this, but we made clear that we would monitor it over time, and that's really what we want to talk about today. And where appropriate, you should keep records and decisions to support those reasonable judgments. We also, as part of that, have provided some supplementary advice on our accounts direction so that auditors can take this into account in relation to spending as they review your accounts, which is now the way in which you report on investment. And we did say as part of that quite specifically, some providers, the coronavirus pandemic may have led to fundamental shifts, and spend in some areas may be materially reduced. So we have provided extra advice on that. We're aware that notwithstanding this, it has been challenging to report in spending in that way required. On the one hand, that does to a degree support some of the changes we've made, focusing more on outcomes than spending, and indeed from 2020-21 shifting away from collecting information on student success investment. But I do also want to acknowledge that it has been a challenge for many institutions to respond to that during the last few months. Elizabeth will say more in a moment about how we intend to monitor other aspects of your plans, which is really the main focus today. But I thought I would highlight three issues really to set up that presentation and that discussion. So the first thing to say is, I think we're clear that we have a higher level of tolerance for regulatory risks relating to the 2019-20 plans than we will have for those from 2021 onwards. That's in part because we approve the 19-20 plans as an interim step to support registration of providers with the OFS as a new regulator, whilst we consulted on more fundamental changes from 2021 onwards. And of course, in part due to the circumstances of the pandemic for the second half of the 19-20 year. So we will apply that higher level of risk tolerance to our assessment of your 19-20 returns and the decisions we make about whether to take any action in relation to them. So that's clearly our approach for 19-20, although we think that's unlikely to continue for 2021 onwards. Notwithstanding that, We know that the delivery of the 2021 onwards plans has also been disrupted. So some timescales may need to change, some of your priorities may have changed, and we will give you an opportunity to highlight that to us when you send us your returns. And also, if you had enhanced monitoring requirements which have now been paused and which we will be phasing out, we'll give you the opportunity to provide those reports to us as part of these returns. The third thing to say is that we're expecting there could be changes to the 2021 plans due to the circumstances in which you're now working. So, for example, more students may become eligible for financial support, and indeed you may need to invest more to tackle some of the practical barriers associated with blended and online learning for some groups of students. You may want to put more focus on different routes and modes of delivery. So we know, for example, that there are high levels of demand study locally, high numbers going into FE colleges and FE, alongside higher education. So you may be interested in putting more focus on FE-HE partnerships and indeed supporting adults who want to retrain. What we aim to do is, once we have your monitoring reports in the spring, which Elizabeth will talk about, to have individual discussions with you about changes that you may want to make to your plans. But a starting point of that from our point of view is we want it to be a something for something discussion. So we don't want to reduce the overall level of ambition and indeed credibility across the 5 years of your plans. We want to agree something that you'll do if you want to change it from what you committed to do so far. Just to finish off, so it was clear, and Sarah said this to a degree already, it was clear to all of us involved in consulting on reforms to access and participation in the first year of the OFS in 2018. And indeed, when we had discussions with every individual university and colleges about new plans in 2019, that there was a real appetite for change and indeed to achieve a step change through the longer period for plans, to translate 2 decades of work on widening participation into fair and more equal access to all parts of higher education, to give all students a more equal opportunity to continue with their studies and achieve the top grades, to bring different parts of universities and colleges together, so to bring admissions, outreach, student support, learning and teaching, careers teams together for a genuinely institution-wide approach, and indeed to understand better than ever before whether all of this was working in practice. That's what we saw when we did the assessment of plans in 2019. So it's more important than ever now, given the circumstances we're all experiencing, that we get that back on track. That's it for me. I look forward to the Q&A, which we'll come back to when Elizabeth has spoken. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. So Elizabeth, as Chris says, the Q&A, a chance to ask questions of Chris at the end of this section. So Elizabeth, can we ask you now to take us through the monitoring expectations, if you like, for access and participation plans like for 2019, 2020?
Yeah, happy to, Sarah, and just say thanks to Chris for that really helpful kind of policy positioning and setup for this part, this presentation. So just want to start off by saying thank you very much for attending in what must be a very turbulent time for you as an organisation, also as individuals, and very much for your students as well. We had a really great student panel, the OFS student panel discussion just last week, and we were talking about access and participation, and in particular the student submission, which I'll get onto. And I just always am so invigorated and refreshed and inspired by how interested and enthusiastic and passionate they are about access and participation and equality of opportunity for underrepresented students. I really hope this session will provide you with some useful information. I also hope that it will provide you with some reassurance so that you have some kind of idea about what to expect moving forward in terms of monitoring access and participation plans. But I also hope that perhaps it will give you a little bit of reassurance that for those of you that are making expected progress against your plans, that this will be a low burden process in the future. So in this session, I'm just going to talk you through some practical information, but I'll start by providing a little bit of context as background for this. So we are developing a new approach to access and participation plan monitoring, and that is because the OFS was created, and also we had access and participation reforms in 2018. So this will be the first time that we're actually monitoring access and participation plans, and we're very much hoping to monitor 2019-20 plans in spring 2021, and then hoping to monitor 2020 to 2021 onwards plans from spring 2022. It's always a bit confusing when the number of dates that we have available, so I'll try and make it as clear as possible. So in line with the access and participation plan reforms, we said that the aim is that for 2019-20 plans, we will be piloting this new monitoring process this year. And that's very much what we are intending to do, with a view of finalising the process for the 2021 monitoring of plans. So as I said, that is what we are intending to do. However, of course, 2019 and 20 is a little bit of an anomalous year. So not only have we got COVID, obviously putting a bit of a spanner in the works, we also have the fact that 2019-20 plans were interim plans prior to the access and participation reforms. So we'll be somewhat piloting the process this year, but the reality is that the monitoring for 2021 plans will reflect the design and the template of the 2021 plans themselves. For us, of course, a critical aspect, as Chris and also Sarah laid out for us, is that you're poised to make expected progress against those ambitious targets, objectives and written commitments in your 2021 onwards plans that could result in that real step change in progress in access and participation. It's also worth saying that, as always, alongside access and participation plan regulation, we will continue to provide support and effective practice resources to enable and to help you make progress in that respect and against access and participation aims and objectives and whatever you would like to achieve. Okay, so we'll move on to the aims of monitoring. So if I can have the next slide, thank you. It's lovely when the technology works. So access and participation plans come under condition A1 of the regulatory framework. So the ultimate purpose of monitoring is for the OFS. We want to determine the likelihood that a provider will have an approved plan in the future. So that could also link to whether a plan will roll over, plan approval will roll over in the future, and also whether provider has taken all reasonable steps to deliver the commitments in its access and participation plan. Also detailed in the regulatory framework, we give a little bit more detail as to what we mean by all reasonable steps. And when we look at all reasonable steps, we will consider the progress made by a provider in delivering the objectives and targets in the plan, but we will also look at the approach and actions and whether you've delivered the written commitments that you said you would do in the plan itself. So it's worth saying that this will be looked at very much on a case-by-case basis, and that's because of just the huge variety of provision that we have in the higher education sector in England that we will very much need to take context into account when looking and monitoring plans. So we'll think about the sources of information and what we'll use to do access and participation plan monitoring. So if we just have the next slide. Thank you. We will draw on lots of different sources of information when monitoring access and participation plans. The first one of those is the OFS Access and Participation Data Dashboard, which is available on the OFS website. We will look at an annual provider monitoring return, which is otherwise known as the impact report. We will look at access and participation expenditure, which will come to us through the financial return. We may look at the student submission, which may be submitted independently to the portal by students, but we very much hope that this would be something that would be done between the student and also provider as well. And we may also look at any other relevant information, such as reportable events or complaints as well. Where we require more information, and we may occasionally ask you for more information, it will probably be about a specific area. This is helpful because it will give you the opportunity to respond should we have any areas of concern around your access and participation plan that have been identified in monitoring. Of course, we may make regulatory interventions as a result of monitoring, and this will be very much in line with the wider OFS regulatory framework. And I should say that interventions very much depend on the nature of the breach or the risk as to what the intervention looks like. It could include things like specific conditions of registration, refusal of an access and participation plan approval in the future, or it could even be a financial penalty. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit about timelines then. It's worth saying that this is what we are working towards at the moment. We will write to you at the end of November confirming some of this information, but we wanted to share with you and give you as much information as possible at this point. As I said, we will write to you at the end of November outlining what you need to do and when. That's the most important thing to say. And we're also hoping to put examples of the impact report and the student submission templates on our website, so you can see what will be expected of you and what you will need to complete. We will be pre-populating some of the impact report, which is the annual provider submission, and these will be available on your portal, on the provider portal, from the new year. We're hoping that things like targets, for example, we can pre-populate, which should reduce overall burden for you. The OFS data dashboard will be updated hopefully by early March. We encourage you very much to review progress not only against your 2019-20 plan, but also we would definitely encourage you to have a look at the OFS data dashboard with your 2021 onwards plan in mind, so that you're poised to make that ambitious progress as and when. The the impact report and also student submission will be due around March, the end of March, and then of course the OFS will assess those monitoring returns and any information that we have, and we will contact you in due course as part of that process. We will also produce a sector-wide monitoring outcomes, a kind of summary, and we'll hope to publish that in the summer 2021. As I said, that's what we're working towards at the moment, but as you are, we're working in an extremely uncertain environment, so we hope we will be able to deliver this and stick to this time frame. I'll just make a note about variations to plans. Chris mentioned this, started to mention this in his introduction, which was really helpful. Thank you very much, Chris. So we're aware that as a result of COVID-19, some of you may need to vary your access and participation plan. As Chris set out, we wouldn't expect any variation of a plan to result in reduced ambition or overall credibility. But we know there may be some circumstances in which you do need to revisit your strategy and the plan itself. So, for example, as a result of COVID-19, you could have identified additional groups who need support, or additional or different strategic measures that you need to deliver in order to deliver your overall ambitious targets and commitments. So if you do think you need to vary your access and participation plan, please email app@officeforstudents.org.uk outlining the context, and we'll give you more information about what you need to do. But I do just need to say that it is up to the Director for Fair Access and Participation, so Chris, to determine whether to approve a variation to a plan. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll give you a little bit more information about the monitoring return specifically. So as said, we're calling this the impact report. I want to just say thank you to anybody who has kindly offered to look at the impact report and give us some early feedback on format, etc. We really do appreciate anybody who has volunteered to do this, and we'll be in touch shortly about that. So start just by talking about the principles that we're working towards with the new approach to monitoring. So very much in line with what we said in the 2018 access and participation reforms. In this context, we are understanding impact to mean outcomes for underrepresented students. Also, in line with more strategic access and participation plans that kind of tell a story, we're also hoping that the monitoring returns, so the impact report, will tell a story. So firstly, what were you trying to achieve? So your kind of strategic aims and objectives, what were you trying to achieve overall? Then, to what extent have you made progress against these aims and objectives? So that could be commentary on progress against targets and objectives, but also in some cases discussion around progress against written commitments in the plan. And then finally, where progress was less than expected, what are you going to do to get back on track with your ambitious access and participation plans? And so this could take the form of a set of actions, for example, about what you're going to do to get back on track. Another principle that we're working towards is proportionality. And this is the one where I hope it will give you some reassurance about the level of what you'll need to do. If you demonstrate that you are making full and expected progress against your targets and objectives, then actually there will be very little other information required from the OFS in the monitoring process. The more that you fail to make expected progress around your targets and objectives, the more information you will start to have to provide to us so that we can assess whether you have taken all reasonable steps to deliver the commitments in your access and participation plan. We also expect that there will be those actions that detail what you're going to do in order to continue progress, expected progress against your access and participation plan. The other thing to say is that we are aware that many of you already produce quite a glossy annual impact report that is accessible and designed to appeal to a wider audience, such as your students, governors, or schools, for example. We would absolutely encourage you to use the information in your OFS impact report to contribute to a document like this. You may also need to add additional information like outcomes of evaluation or the activities that you've done, for example, which many of you already do. But we would definitely encourage you to do that and to help with accessibility wherever you can. And we hope that the two will support each other if anybody does already create that kind of impact report. A PDF of the impact report, of the OFS impact report that you submit to us will be published on the OFS website. So this will be a summary document of the Excel form that you have to complete for us. And we will encourage you to publish this on your website alongside your access and participation plan as well. So to talk more specifically about the 2019-20 monitoring return, which is the impact report, I'll just note again that the formatting very much reflects the 2019-20 targets and the way that the plans were written and set out. We appreciate that some of the 2019-20 targets will have been superseded by the new 5-year plans. So where this is the case, you will need to give us a really clear explanation of why this target is no longer relevant. But we do appreciate that several of the targets will be in this category. There will also be a COVID-19 addendum. So we will be collecting some information about the impact of COVID specifically on the delivery of access and participation plans. And finally, it's worth saying that, as I said, we're piloting this process this year, And at the moment, we're still working with Excel spreadsheets as part of the development, but we do hope in the future to be able to use different methods to collect this information, both for the impact report and the student submission. So again, this is very much a pilot year. So we move on to information about the student submission. So if you move slides, thank you. We have developed a new approach to the student submission to support the provider impact report. We have, as I said at the start, we have been working with the OFS student panel on this. We've worked with the OFS and we've also reached out to student volunteers, and thank you very much to anybody who has put forward representatives, or for any students who've come forward to support with that. It's really valuable, so thank you very much. The student submission will be submitted independently through the provider portal, but don't worry, they won't be able to see any of your information when they do that. And while it is an independent student submission, that's very much something we were looking to achieve. The expectation is very much that universities and colleges will work with students to complete this submission. Indeed, you will probably have to help the students to be able to access information about access and participation plan targets, for example, as some of the student panel, for example, are reporting that even with a bit of support, some of it can be quite difficult to understand sometimes. So very much would like you to work with your students, and that's how it's designed, and really encourage them to complete this submission. The design of the student submission is centred around a constructive conversation where the students are enabled to be critical friends to you as a university or college. And the idea is then that there's a discussion around how you can make the greatest progress in the future. So we really hope in that way that it will be a constructive conversation and that it will be centred around the access and participation plan process. A key principle of all of this, going back to, is clear communication to students, and you will very much have to be a part of that process to enable that to happen. I should say as well, finally, that you will be given the opportunity to respond should there be anything in the student submission that would be of concern. You will have the opportunity to speak to us about that if needs be. So that's everything from me. So I'll hand back over to Sarah now to move on to the Q&A.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's really helpful. So we've got some time now for questions. We've got about 20 minutes. So do please use the Q&A function if you have any more. We have had some come in already, and I will ask the questions on your behalf and field them to the relevant member of the panel, in this case either Chris or Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, some largely technical questions that have come in. So the first question from Sabrina Kumari was, when will HEIs receive guidance on the annual monitoring return, and will the submission date be the same? I think you probably covered that in your presentation, but if you could just confirm. And again, along the sort of timing questions, could you also clarify how much time there'll be between the OFS data dashboard being published and the likely submission deadline for the impact report?
Yes, of course, no problem. So in terms of when providers will hear about this, as I said earlier, we will be sending information out to providers at the end of November, which will detail everything they need to know and everything they need to do. Submissions will be likely due around the end of March, and the access and participation data dashboard should be updated by early March at the latest. So with the form should be available plenty in advance for you all to have a look at, and then you should be prepared for when the access and participation data dashboard is updated, that you'll know what you're doing. You have the groups together that you need in order to review that information.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Chris, I think this is one for you. So this is from Dr. Andrew Ross at the University of Bath. Given the current situation, many universities will have COVID-related excuses as to why they won't meet their 2020-21 milestones. What are the incentives for universities to continue to focus on access and participation and their plans, and not just continue to use COVID as an excuse?
So, well, firstly, I think one of the things that was clear to me when we negotiated all of the new plans was that universities and colleges throughout the sector had themselves strategies around equality and inclusion, and had commitments to their local areas and the people in their local areas. So they themselves, and indeed their academic staff and their student body, believed in what they were doing through these plans. And there was a great sense in which, being able to focus over a longer period of time to implement change was something the university wanted to do, and they could align it with their own strategies. So my first answer on why should you do it is because it fits with your values as an institution. So, in my experience, your staff and students will want you to do this, and given what you say about yourselves, you'll want to do it. So rather than just thinking about the regulatory dimensions, I do think it's worth thinking about what you've said as an institution you want to achieve, and what you're then going to achieve. The second thing I think for me is that, and in a way this is what I was trying to say in my introduction, is I think the pandemic has actually shone a spotlight, an even greater spotlight, on inequality across the country, and particularly inequality as it relates to education. So you saw that over the summer in relation to the assessment approaches and the response to that. And you can see it more broadly in the discussions right now about lockdowns in different areas and the consequences for different parts of the country. So it is going to be the case into the future that there will be even more focus on tackling inequality across the country, whether that relates to places or groups of students and other people. And indeed, education and higher education is going to be very strongly in the spotlight. So I think this is just going to become more important into the future. So again, all the more reason that you develop, good and coherent plans across the period, which cohere with your broader institutional strategies for recovery from the pandemic, and indeed your local strategies where you're based. So for all those reasons, I think there are good reasons why you'll want to do it. And then the regulator is a backstop to all of that.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So a question, I think, well, either Chris or Elizabeth, where work is completed which isn't explicitly mentioned in the 2019-2020 plans, but which is required for the implementation of the 2020-21 plans, will it be counted and recognised as progress towards achieving overall success against targets? Chris, did you want to have a go at that one?
So one of the reasons we're interested in not just 1920, but also 2021 in the reports we collect from you in the spring, is that we know that, and I know because I read all of these plans, that there were a lot of commitments to activity in 1920 to get the 2021 plans up and running. And we know that activity may or may not have been able to happen given the circumstances in which you're working. So that's precisely why we want to collect any insights on the impact on the 2021 plans from what you've been able to do this year. And I think it would be good if you could use that as a way of surfacing things you have achieved by way of a platform for the 2021 plans, not just focus on what you've not been able to do. Thank
you. Okay, we've got a couple here that are related to more technical issues. So is the student submission compulsory? What if our students' union do not have the capacity or resource, or indeed inclination, to complete this activity during this year? What happens if students do not complete their submission? Who takes responsibilities for writing, coordinating them? Elizabeth, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, of course. So we would strongly encourage you to support your student representatives to submit a student submission alongside the provider impact report, but for the very reasons that you've just detailed there. It is an optional submission, because we can't compel students to do this student submission. But as I said, all the students that I come across, they're so passionate and inspired about access and participation. I think a lot of them will be really motivated to be engaged and want to talk about this issue, particularly in light of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. And sort of staying with the more, did you, so we've got a question here. Did you say the 5-year plan supersedes the 2019-2020 plan? No, I think we actually mean that there may be some aspects or some targets that have been superseded by the 2021 plans, but it's not that the entire plan itself has been superseded. We are still monitoring against the activities in those plans. Chris, one for you. This is from Jenny Henley. As a small specialist arts institution, we set a high ambition for our access and participation plan. The status of arts careers has changed considerably during the pandemic, as has arts education opportunities. Therefore, the landscape has shifted both for those coming into our institution, impacting on recruitment, and the profession that they hope to enter, impacting on careers. I hear that we're not expected to reduce ambition, but is it realistic to still uphold the ambition we had prior to the pandemic? And what are the implications if we can't?
Okay, thanks. So I mean, the first thing to do is to acknowledge that creative and performing arts are disciplines that have been particularly challenged by lockdown. So I know from talking to colleagues who work in specialist institutions or in art and design or drama departments in universities that delivering learning in those subjects is one of the, they are among the subjects where this has been hardest. So we absolutely recognize that. That's even before you get into the impact on the professions and the industries, which of course could have an effect on whether or not students choose to study in those areas into the future, and at the other end, the prospects for graduates. And we will all want to work together to ensure that one of areas where we are genuinely world leading, we continue to be into the future. Students still want to study this. We still have some of the best graduates in the world driving really successful industries in these areas. I think on the specific issues of the plans, I think this is where the something for something discussion comes in. So we recognise that there could be an impact on levels of demand, although demand actually looks pretty high at the moment. We recognise, of course, there could be impact on how you can deliver learning and teaching and then the experience of your students, but then also at the other end in terms of what happens to your graduates. So your overall targets, you may want to discuss with us whether they need to change, but we'll be looking for you to demonstrate you're doing something instead of that reflects the particular environment we're in. So we want to have an individualized conversation with you, which we will do on the back of the reports that you send us in the spring.
Thanks, Chris. So a question here regarding the dashboard. So in terms of the A&P data dashboard, where data for a provider is limited due to the provider being new and/or numbers in certain categories being too small, how would this be managed? Elizabeth, or did you want to?
We've got Matt here, who should
Matt?
answer that.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I can answer that one. We'd hope that in most cases providers would set targets where they do have data that is reportable. That may not always be the case for certain providers, especially small specialists, for example. But where that data isn't available, there are some other things that providers can do to try and overcome that, potentially looking at different aggregations of data. So rather than looking at a single year of data, looking at a group of years together to try and help build the reportability of the data, perhaps looking at other levels of study, for example. And where there isn't any relevant data in the OFS dashboard, they can look to other sources of data that might be external to this, potentially Heis data or other data from organizations like the ONS that might be useful in this regard.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So there's been a couple of questions around your comments on enhanced monitoring, Chris. So we've got, we had a requirement for enhanced monitoring for our 2020 to 24-25 plan that was required between January the 1st and January the 31st, 2021. Has this changed? If not, what will be the process for submitting what is required? And then another question around that, Chris mentioned enhanced monitoring being phased out. Can he expand on that, please?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So, so the first thing to say is when we moved into lockdown in March, we paused enhanced monitoring as part of the reducing regulatory requirements and wanting both you and ourselves to be able to focus on the most important issues around supporting students at the present time. So they're currently paused. You may well have seen over the summer announcements by the government and indeed OFS and the research councils and Department of Health around a broad agenda around reducing regulatory burden. As part of that, we have made a commitment as the OFS, not just in relation to Condition A1, access and participation, but more broadly to phase out enhanced monitoring as far as we can, so to use it as little as possible. We used a lot of enhanced monitoring, not just for access and participation, but in other areas, as a way of managing risk around initial registration. So we brought into the sector very wide range of providers, and indeed on access and participation we moved from an annual process to a 5-year process. And one of the ways we managed that, the risks arising from that, was to say, okay, we want reports on very particular things in the first year, whether that be the first year of plans in this sphere, or more broadly the first year of registration for the OFS. We still would like to know what's happened in relation to the issues we highlighted for enhanced monitoring, because in assessing things, we judged they were really crucial to their success. So often there was a new piece of work that had not been tested. So you were evaluating it and then deciding on the back of that whether or not to set a target. In many cases, it related to actually there was a commitment to develop new data and then understand populations more, and that to drive the strategy. So we still want to know about things like that because we think that will be crucial to the forward plan. But we're not aiming to collect it as a separate enhanced monitoring reporting process, and we won't want reports if they were due in January 2021. What we will do in the correspondence we send at the end of the month is say, can you give us this information if it was due during the current year, alongside your monitoring report in the spring? So we still want to know it, but we're going to try and minimize the separate reporting by collecting it alongside the monitoring report in the spring.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So Elizabeth, I think one for you from Jess Bond. Could you clarify if you'll be expecting the impact report and the student submission to be formally approved by our governing body before submission, or is the accountable officer approval enough? And also, will you be providing easy to understand general guidance, training, briefings centrally for students who will be involved in completing the student submission, rather than everybody needing to do this separately?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So on the first question around the governing body, so as with all our the OFS-wide regulation, things that are submitted to us are submitted on behalf of the governing body. So you need to go through the appropriate sign-off processes with that in mind in your organisation. The second thing was around the easy to understand guidance. We are working on that. We're working on some accessible guidance. We're working on a conversation guide, and we've also got a form that's hopefully more accessible and that we've tested with students. It is worth saying that this is the pilot, and I hope we will do as much as we can for this time round, but I hope it will be then further improved on for future monitoring rounds as well.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so we've got time for a couple more. So a question here, it's been posted anonymously. In view of the incredible demands on providers during the pandemic and their impressive responses in relation to access and participation, does it not make more sense for you as a pragmatic regulator to focus on asking what providers are doing now in response to the pandemic, rather than concentrating on 5-year plans?
Okay.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks. So, so I think we have, I'm bound to say, I think we have been a pragmatic regulator. So all the changes we made in March were intended to focus down on what we thought were the most important issues. That didn't just relate to access and participation, but specifically on access and participation, we enabled more flexibility. There is engagement with universities and colleges now about what is happening now, and that happens particularly in relation to quality and standards. And so, colleagues who work on that are engaging with individual universities and colleges about their circumstances and picking up issues that arise from, for example, reportable events. So we are engaging with what's happening now, but that's not necessarily what we're doing through access and participation. The 1920 plan is exactly an opportunity to say this is what's happened during this year and to enable us to understand that. In relation to whether or not we should worry about forward plans, well, I come back to what I said in the first question, which is, I think as we progress this over the next 6 months, we're not going to see concerns about inequality to reduce, and we're not going to see the focus on inequality in education reduce. So we will want to have a strong focus on access and participation and a clear plan for that across the sector and in individual providers beyond next year. It's a requirement in the Act, and that's not going to change. But we are open to discussing with you how your plans could change in relation to what's happened over the next 6 months. And we're not collecting these reports until next spring. So we are enabling quite a bit of time to pass and greater understanding before we get the information from you. Okay,
thanks, Chris. So a question here regarding planned activity that's been disrupted. So a lot of our planned outreach in 2019-2020 was intended for the summer and hugely disrupted. Some planned spend was reallocated to student support for disadvantaged groups, but this was responsive given timeframes. With regard to reviews of expenditure in 2019-20, is there any particular level of underspend at which you would expect concern, or is this solely something you would expect explanation of on a case-by-case basis? Elizabeth or Chris?
I'm happy to start off. I think ultimately we're looking at reasonable judgments, and so I'm very cautious about providing kind of boundaries around that. We have enabled flexibility, and we want you to articulate how you applied that and how your decision making worked in relation to that, and what happened and what didn't happen. But I'm always cautious about being too binary about these things. We're looking for you to demonstrate reasonable judgments, which is what is appropriate to a diverse sector. I don't know, Elizabeth, do you want to add anything into that?
Yeah, just to reiterate that that investment is one of a number of things that we'll look at if we need to look at whether a provider has taken all reasonable steps to deliver the commitments in their plan. And also just to reiterate that if we do have concerns, we may ask you for more detail about a certain area, and in that case you would be given the opportunity to provide further information and detail if needs be.
Okay. All right. I think we're just about coming towards the end of this part of the event. So I'm going to draw the Q&A to a close. I will say that we haven't obviously been able to answer everybody's questions. We will be gathering these questions together and treating them thematically, and then putting a Q&A up on the website, as well as the recording of this session. So we will try and answer the questions as much as we can that we haven't been able to get to in the session. So we're now going to have a 5-minute break. We'll reconvene at 14:35 for the next session, when we'll hear from colleagues in the sector on managing the challenges thrown up by the pandemic. So yeah, hope to see you again in 5 minutes. Welcome back, colleagues. I hope you managed to get yourself a cup of tea in the short break that we had. So we're now going to move into the second session of this afternoon. We're going to hear from colleagues within the sector about the various ways in which they've dealt with some of the challenges that they've encountered as a result of the pandemic. And they're going to do that across the student life cycle. So we're going to be hearing about work undertaken during the access stage of the life cycle, student success stage and the progression stage. So each speaker will talk for between 5 and 7 minutes. And then, as we did with the last session, we'll leave the questions and answers for the end, where you can put them to individual members of the panel. So we're going to start with welcoming Mike Nicholson. Mike is the Director of Undergraduate Admissions and Outreach at the University of Bath, and he's going to talk about the additional barriers to access posed by the pandemic and the measures that the University of Bath have put in place to support students to access higher education. So Mike, if you're ready, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Just to start, I guess, one of the big challenges that we saw this year at the university was a very differential response from schools and colleges. Primarily, the big challenge we had was that the state sector, if you exclude the selective schools, was probably slowest off the blocks when compared with the independent schools, the selective state schools, and even the international schools. So in many senses, we were bombarded with requests for outreach activity and evening events and events for parents from the schools who were probably, in terms of today's event, those who we least needed to be focusing attention on, and efforts that we were making to reach out to schools and colleges who were from those groups were often falling on deaf ears. We were kind of using or trying to engage with our contact names and getting very little back. Now, what seems to have happened in retrospect is that because of the nature of the management and leadership in those schools, the attention of that group was very much focused on getting the centre assessed grades moderated and checked and submitted, and there was just no spare capacity to then be engaging in activity for higher education. And where it was happening, much of the focus was on the students who were due to start in 2020 with very limited activity on the 2021 and onwards groups of students. So a lot of the big events that were organised through people like UCAS, the activities that involved the university's minister, it was primarily focused at reassuring those students who were due to start in 2020, rather than activity that was primarily engaged at encouraging people for 2021 and onwards. Added to that was a challenge, I think, experienced by many around the variable nature of access to technology that students had. It's pretty clear from the work that's been done in recent months that digital poverty and access to technology is quite a key differentiating factor. And whilst again, there have been valiant efforts to try and engage in that, my favourite initiative was some work that Lancaster University did with one of the major bus providers, who basically went and parked a whole load of buses that were wireless enabled in rural communities to provide access to the internet. But that sort of thinking, which was very, very innovative, didn't necessarily get over the problem that students were then trying to view and engage with activity online and through mobile phones rather than through wireless desktop enabled machines. I think that's then had a knock-on effect as well, because obviously there are challenges in running physical events on university campuses at the minute. And as we move into a second phase of lockdown in England, that challenge is going to all more increase. But also, of course, the lack of UCAS higher education fairs in the latter part of the 2019-2020 academic year means that there's just, again, a whole group of students who haven't had the opportunity to engage with the university campuses, find out what a university campus is like, come and view accommodation, get a sense of the university community. And that clearly is having a knock-on impact on the ways that this 2021 applicant pool are engaging with higher education this year. Things are on a much slower start. And unless there's been a clear need to apply because of, say, the 15th of October Oxbridge deadline or the medical school deadline, then I think we're going to see things trickling in at a much, much slower rate than in previous years, and with students maybe more reluctant to commit without actually having had the chance to view the goods that they're engaging with or the goods they're buying. I would say the other thing that we've also begun to experience is Zoom fatigue. Students spend quite a lot of their time, even if they're getting in-person teaching in schools, online. And then the idea that the only way they can really then engage with higher education institutions is online after school or at weekends, because many schools quite rightly are protecting their valuable teaching time, means that students just may sign up for something. But I think certainly on most of the events that we've run recently at the University of Bath, we're seeing about a 50% return on the people who've registered and the people who actually turn up and engage. It is, I think, also clear that different universities reacted in different ways. I'm certainly aware that some colleagues in outreach teams were put on furlough as the university assumed that without the sort of need to go out and do school visits, then those staff could effectively be put onto a furlough scheme. And that, of course, meant that activity to develop activity for 2021 and onwards just wasn't happening. At Bath, we took a very conscious decision to try and use the time to refocus our activity, rethink how we delivered things. And that crucial period from about late March through to the middle of May, there was a lot of innovative thinking in the team. We did a lot of restructuring and reorganizing, particularly of the summer school program that we'd originally intended to deliver in person. And we were able to make that happen online and with significantly increased reach as well. Our normal summer schools would have maybe got us about 300, 350 students on site. The online versions that we ran allowed us to engage with over 900 students, and geography didn't matter anymore. One of the challenges we have as a university in the Southwest is we don't necessarily have easy access geographically to students in some of those areas where we really do need to attract engagement if we're going to have a wider geographical spread that includes many of those areas that are IMD and Polar 1 and 2. And historically, that's been a bit of a challenge, but this year we found that we got much greater engagement from those areas because we were working online. I think that probably leads me into where I want to finish, which is there have been some clear silver linings. The opportunity for staff to actually have some time to step back from a fairly ambitious program of activity and delivery has been good. It's given them a chance to rethink and reframe their work. I think I would say we've found that it's often much easier to get hold of staff who aren't in the immediate outreach team. So we had no shortage of academic colleagues who were able to deliver online and engage online, whereas historically we may have had much more trouble getting them to appear at in-person events over the summer. And I think it's also encouraged us to look at how we are operating. One of the success stories in our area has been the real strength of our UniConnect hub, who had staff embedded in schools. It's meant that as schools have restarted and re-engaged, we've had people in position to do ongoing delivery. We've also found that that kind of collaborative activity, particularly with students in years 9 to 11, that we've tended to operate now through the UniConnect hubs, has been much, much faster to recover than some of the more individualized events that the university may be offering. And then finally, two other areas tying somewhat into the sessions we've just had. I think we've probably had much better and much closer engagement with our students' union and student bodies and student groups over the last 8 to 10 months at Bath than we maybe historically have had, in part because there were many, many more mechanisms set up to manage the pandemic that then brought us into direct contact with student groups and student colleagues from the Students' Union. And finally, we've seen some really innovative thinking from some of the education third sector charities, particularly Brilliant Club and Brightside, who've used this as an opportunity to really push forward many of their approaches and their engagement with students.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Mike. So we'll move straight on then, and I'd like to welcome now Louise Banaheen, who is the Director of Educational Engagement at the University of Leeds. And Louise is going to talk about the challenge to the university experience caused by COVID-19 and the measures the universities put in place to support their students' success and sense of belonging. So Louise, if you're ready.
Thanks, Sarah. So as lockdown loomed, Leeds, like many universities, mapped out what COVID would mean for student success outcomes, including non-continuation and degree attainment or degree awarding gaps. And for us, this involved a risk assessment mapping the issues and the steps that were required to mitigate. And there were clear actions that needed to be taken across areas, including personal tutoring and welcome and induction. And we also took action to provide targeted support for learners, such as those who are care leavers or estranged. But there was one area that was really relevant to all the changes and much more, and that was about how we develop a sense of belonging amongst our students. For us, that meant the way in which students feel that they're accepted, valued, included and encouraged by others, including their peers. We recognise that different types of delivery of teaching, including online, the lived experiences of students during COVID, all meant that there needed to be a profound shift in both our assumptions, but also as well the way in which we proactively develop a sense of belonging amongst our students. In thinking about it, we looked at it in terms of peer, academic and administrative engagement and the formal and informal campus spaces that our students inhabit. We were clear that developing a sense of belonging required conscious changes to teaching online, where it was happening online, but there also needed to be additional care to ensure that students didn't feel isolated, and a recognition that there will always be students who find developing a sense of belonging harder than others, and we need to be able to target and proactively support those students more so than ever. To look at this in more detail, we set up working groups and we linked in with existing work streams that were developed in response to COVID, so particularly around student experience or about how we would be delivering digital teaching and learning where we were. In that teaching and learning space, we embedded guidance about how to support students in developing that sense of belonging from the outset. It really focused on providing that clarity that it comes from more than just the social activities and the relevance of it, whether you're delivering face-to-face or online or a combination of the two. And we were particularly giving consideration to circumstances beyond a student's identity, which can create those barriers to engagement and motivation. And the student perspectives from those that were on that group, including the perspectives of students who are commuters, for example, was incredibly valuable. We also developed resources specifically aimed at staff on developing a sense of belonging with practical tips and guidance. We ran with a key message throughout this, which was about it being a responsibility of everybody to make small changes and make that difference. And we embedded it into central communications. We ran staff and student-led events and provided space for colleagues to run events and activities to promote this under the banner of a sense of belonging. And it was really effective in providing opportunities to discuss it in more detail, but also actually to go beyond that and think about a sense of belonging amongst staff in more detail and the ways in which we can explore and develop that further. Evaluation was a key strand of this approach. We were fortunate enough to have 2 academic fellowships who were exploring how you can evaluate a sense of belonging amongst our students. So we're using that first round of data as a baseline and then following up to develop an understanding of what this looks like over the course of the year for subgroups as well as the wider cohort of students. And we're also using other forms of evaluation to understand the qualitative picture and what it looks like from the perspective, particularly of specific underrepresented groups. It's been really, really successful, and I think that it's been interesting how it's really captured the interest of a very wide group of both academic and professional staff, as well as students and our students' union. And I thought that it would be useful just to flag what I thought were particularly effective enablers through that process. I think that one of them was around leadership at all levels. So we had colleagues from the most senior through to colleagues who were perhaps more the coalface who were involved in the work. We also had a very strong collaboration between academic, professional staff, students' union and students, and there was real partnership working there. There was a very clear link both to our access and participation plan, but also related institutional strategies. The work was very much focused on how we can develop that sense of belonging and thinking about it from the perspectives of underrepresented groups. But it was with this recognition that if we can get it right for those groups of students, then it's going to be of benefit to the wider cohort. And embedding it into our central communications and it being an ongoing discussion with examples of good practice has been really effective at keeping the conversation going, bringing people along with it so that colleagues can develop their approach to it. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Louise. That's brilliant. And can I just remind colleagues, if you do have questions, please do post them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function. Okay, next I'd like to welcome Ellen Cocking from the Head of Careers and Employability Services at the Open University, who will be talking about their progression activities, including virtual internships, which they've targeted at underrepresented groups. So Ellen, if you're ready.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and I'm aware of time, so I'll try and be as economical as I can be. Thank you for inviting me today, and certainly I think the context of COVID is one that obviously all of us are navigating and battling through. The Open University is a distance learning institution, as many of you will be aware, and for that reason our delivery is already online. And so therefore a lot of the activity that we are already engaged in is in that online distance delivery mode. So there are a number of activities that we have been working on and are honing to ensure that we deliver effectively to our students at a distance. Virtual internships is a project that we embarked upon about 18 months ago. And I think the main focus of our initial activities was to ensure that we built an infrastructure and a model that was robust and that would support both students and employers throughout the process of setting up and delivering a virtual internship. Obviously, what that allows and enables is for somebody in whatever location to be able to work with an employer in whatever location, providing a lot more flexibility for both students and employers. We set up materials and a process to support both groups, and also some videos for employers to be able to understand the process of recruiting at that distance. Obviously, a lot more recruitment is now online and employers are much more familiar with that, but pre-COVID, that wasn't necessarily the case. So we put together a range of materials to ensure that students and employers were supported. We found that in the application process, a very significant number of students from WP programs applied. Around 60 to 64%. Those who were successful, it was a little lower, around the 50% mark. But even so, just with a small number of internships, and this has been small to start with, we have identified that a significant number of WP students have engaged with this, which is a really positive sign. In terms of scale, in the last year, we offered 22 internships, which is a small number, particularly when you have 170,000 students. However, the idea of this is to develop a model, and it's to develop the support materials and resources for both employers and students to enable and empower individuals to potentially set up their own internships and experiences and so on. So that, if you like, is the goal behind this, to both engage a broader range of students, but also to enable and empower students to progress on themselves and undergo and explore horizons, if you like, in setting up potentially their own internships. There have been a range of other activities that we have engaged in terms of online careers fairs, and again we have identified that greater proportions of students from WP groups have engaged with that as an activity. And that's certainly a real positive in terms of supporting the cohorts as part of APP. Another activity that we have engaged in is and begun is a pilot project called Achieving Your Goals, which encompassed the career registration or career readiness approach that quite a number of universities have adopted, which surveys students around their needs when they begin study and then resurvey them at different points along the way. And that enables us to assess their needs, understand better their needs. And what we will be doing using data insights is to better understand specific cohorts and the needs of those cohorts, so that we can very proactively push and develop resources out to those students. I'm very aware of time, so I'll stop there, but those are just some snippets of activity that we've been engaging in.
Thanks very much, Ellen. That's really interesting. Okay, so I'd like to welcome our final panelist. This is Megan Nichols, who's Vice Principal for Higher Education at New College Durham, and who's going to offer us an HE in FE perspective, and we'll be talking about how the college has adjusted its teaching, learning and assessment approaches, focusing on part-time mature students who were particularly impacted by the pandemic. So, Megan, if you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Yes, as Sarah mentioned, I'm an FE college delivering HE. We have approximately 1,000 students. So we deliver our own foundation degrees, but also a wide range of degrees and master's programs. So we have a split of students from full and part-time. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our part-time students, being mature students, studying whilst in employment, and often using that study as part of their own career progression and development. One of the key focuses we did looking at lockdown was we thought we needed to provide a clear and meaningful communication with our students. And so, anticipating that imminent lockdown, we actually acknowledged that we needed to look at ways and strategies of engaging our students that was allowing them to continue to achieve and engage in their studies, whether that was to complete the first year of their programme or to progress on to year 2 or 3 of a programme and achieve their end award. So during lockdown, teaching and learning was paramount to our students, and really ensuring that the students were engaged in that was really important to us. So we reviewed our assessment and identified programmes which required some adaptation, similar to other universities and colleges, just to look at the work that students had to submit and ensuring that we were able to adapt that. And often, because we were delivering for vocational programmes, we were looking at that practical element and reflecting on the informal assessments we'd already taken place and looking at ways that we could work with students to continue with those elements of the programme. And one of the things we did look at was adapting the times that we work with students online to accommodate the students' work patterns. Often our students had family commitments, and in some cases, students only had one computer in the home, which was for the entire family, and they were sharing that. So we would look at different times within the day to communicate with our students. And we implemented some emergency regulations, and part of that was reviewing our mitigation and extenuating circumstances process. So removing the need for students to submit external evidence, to provide an application for extensions, but looking for a supporting statement from the tutor as well as the student statement, so to look at how we could extend their assessment deadlines. We quickly realised that those mitigation and extenuating circumstances were coming in thick and fast. So we convened weekly meetings to look at those extensions, And what that allowed us to do was to identify very quickly those students that were struggling to work remotely, and enabled us to respond quickly to support those students. And those situations changed on a weekly basis, and particularly for our part-time and mature students, many of whom were key workers, therefore their studies were being affected by the increased demands of their employers working additional hours. And for those with children or caring responsibilities, they were trying to juggle their studies around home and work, and often homeschooling their children as well. I think the information that we did gather from holding those mitigation meetings weekly was that we recognised that our mature students really valued the time they would normally be on campus. And some of them really struggled with not being able to have that me time for them. So that was their studies, studying away from home and away from work. And often a lot of them were really struggling to work remotely, acknowledging that, you know, that it was particularly difficult for those students to look at their studies and to continue with their studies. We worked with our module tutors to look at agreed plans that were manageable milestones to support those students to achieve. And in some cases that has moved to submission dates that were in September. But also for those that had childcare or caring commitments, we've actually looked at those dates that have been moved to December for those students. So we have come up with some clear plans, individualised plans for those students to help manage those assessments and milestones, and we continue to work with those students. Other things that we did were that our academic skills tutor absolutely demonstrated an increase in the number of students, particularly mature students, requesting one-to-one tutorials. Of the academic support tutor one-to-one sessions that were set out, we identified 79% of our students were mature students requesting that additional support. And a lot of that was just some reassurance and some advice on how to approach their assessments and manage those assessments. So we provided a really responsive service for that, looking at trying to respond really quite timely, and offering various means by responding either through our intranet or via Teams or the usual phone calls and emails. We also worked with our student union and acknowledged that some students were struggling from mental health, and we produced a mental health booklet and also an infographic for students to promote academic integrity and to warn against the dangers of academic malpractice. Where we had some practical elements of assessment which were required, once the restrictions were slightly eased in May and June, what we did, we worked with our students to look at dates and times when they could come onto campus and use the facilities to complete their assessments, which that was really welcomed by some of our students as well and taken up. I think finally, what we also wanted to do, and like our similar speakers today, try and learn from the experience that we had from March throughout the last academic year. And so we used an online survey for our students and asked them to tell us and respond on how they actually felt they'd adapted to online learning. And this has really helped identify students' preferences to remote learning, and has enabled us to shape and support the way that in which our curriculum teams have approached the planning for December and the design for September moving forward. I think that's about all for me at the moment. I'll move over to Sarah.
That's great. Thanks, Megan. It's really helpful. Okay, so we've got around 20 minutes again for questions. So as I say, do please post your questions in the Q&A panel for any of our panelists. We have some to start off already. So Mike, I think this is one for you. It's around the access issue. And I think there's a key question here is, are the challenges for the 2021 entry cohort greater, or will they be greater than those experienced by the 2020 cohort intake?
I think that's a really good question, Sarah. One of the things obviously we're very conscious of is that the 2020 entry intake had pretty much finished their education. They maybe didn't end up taking exams, and certainly there is a question about whether that last kind of polishing that often goes on where students are effectively doing their exam prep, and that's allowing them to synthesize ideas, means that the lack of that possibly meant that students struggled a bit more with transition in 2020. But we've got to remember that the 2021 intake had all of that disruption at a point in time when a lot of the synoptic content in their post-16 studies was only just beginning to kind of be reached. They've obviously, in many cases, schools weren't able to run the normal series of assessments, so students maybe went into year 13 upper 6 with possibly less of a sense of how they were doing or where their weaknesses and strengths were. And then, of course, we've had a quite significant set of challenges, I think, for many schools in restarting the process, trying to fit around exam changes and things like that. So I think actually there's a lot more to be said about the 2021 intake and the need for support for that group than probably we anticipated for the 2020. On the positive side, of course, this is a group of students who have primarily been engaging online for most of their studies, and in that sense, some of the transition issues to university that the 2020 students who hadn't had much of that experienced, the 2021 intake should actually be much more confident about.
Thanks, Mike, that's really helpful. Louise, there's a questions come in regarding the work that you've been doing in Leeds. Could you give us your top tips for social belonging in teaching, if possible, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I should say that the work that has been undertaken in this area was a collective effort across a wide range of colleagues. So I can't take the credit for the tips. But what I would say is that, yeah, absolutely, the social element is incredibly important. Some of the aspects that we looked at in terms of tips was firstly around ensuring that there are opportunities, I suppose, to develop that social side on your course. So organising events, I suppose, outside of the curriculum, whether they are film nights or other kind of social activities. But there was also guidance on making sure that colleagues proactively signpost students to other parts of the university, such as faith and well-being and sustainability partners. We recognise that co-curricular activities are really important in developing that sense of belonging through new friendship groups. So there was quite a lot of work to map out what the opportunities look like for this academic year, recognising that some of those would be delivered entirely online, but also as well, it may not be as easy for students to stumble upon it. So giving guidance to staff about how they could signpost to it. And then lastly was a real reminder to colleagues just to remember that some students do have work and family and other commitments that mean that they can't take part in additional activities. So just applying some sensitivity in that space.
Thanks, Louise. That's really helpful. Ellen, there's two related questions, I think, for you. So the first is, how do you know that these activities are benefiting students from the cohorts you want to target? And what level of engagement do you get from students in those target cohorts? And how do you engage with the cohorts directly?
Yes, I think one of the pieces around engagement, we are looking to measure much more effectively, and we have been doing some work on this around the various aspects of our services from careers and employability particularly, to identify which students are engaging with which services. So whether that's our online fairs, whether it's the virtual internships, whether it's things like our one-to-one service or webinars and forums, and actually kind of mapping across the whole student engagement piece, which groups of students are engaging in those particular activities, so that we can really see where that engagement is, and so therefore where we may need to actually address that. I think the data that we have already around particularly our online fairs, for example, does show that there is particularly a greater proportion of students with disabilities engaging with those sorts of online events. So we know that the message is getting across to a certain extent. However, there are other groups, students from lower IMDb codes are not engaging as much with some of those activities. So that's one of the challenges that we need to work out over the next few months, is to actually identify how we might target those specific students. And what I'm hoping is that the career readiness or career registration approach that we are adopting will enable us to highlight and understand what those individual students are, or those groups of students rather than individuals are saying about where they're at in the process of planning their careers. So that will help us to better understand how we can target. I think I've answered all of your questions, have I there?
Yeah, I think so. That's lovely. Thank you, Ellen. So Megan, I think this is a question actually that I'm very interested in myself, which is you talked about the personalisation of the support that you provide to your students, and also that you are arranging with them individually when they can come in to do their sort of more practical elements of their assessments and so on. I mean, in terms of what that means for your institution and the way that you work, what are some of the kind of pragmatic challenges of being able to offer that highly personalised services? Or have you just found it's just part of how you operate?
I think because we're a smaller organisation and obviously don't have the large numbers that universities offer, we do have a more personalised approach to our students, and I suppose that sets us as an advantage in one way, because most of our staff, well, our staff know all of our students and are able to identify and easily respond to students when they know that students aren't engaging as much as they should do, and get a sense of how students are coping with, and particularly with the pandemic, when we held meetings with our programme teams, they were really able to identify students within their groups where they were struggling to get contact. And I suppose for us, yes, it is a challenge, I think, you know, trying to look at that individualised approach, but that wasn't for all students. So some of the students fared very well and were able to get on and work at home and with the equipment that they had, particularly for our music students, for example. But there were some students that just didn't have access to that equipment, and that was a number of students, but the staff were aware of that very quickly and then worked and liaised very closely with the students, so that we could look at times that fitted with those students and to bring them onto campus and allowed them to work. And there are challenges. Some students, like all students, don't respond, and decided that it was just a step too far. What's really commendable from staff, and I know there'll be staff across the sector, is the resilience that staff have shown during this, you know, current pandemic, to continue to work with students and to continue to engage with them, and to look at that sense of belonging that we talked about with the colleague from Leeds as well, about how that was working.
Okay, thanks, Megan. That's really interesting. Okay, Mike, a question for you around outreach again. How effective do you think the sector was in undertaking collaborative outreach activities? I'm assuming during this period.
I think it was very mixed. I've already highlighted, certainly at our local level, the value of UniConnect, and how that had already, because it already had a very well-established footprint in schools and colleges, allowed it to just keep going through that period, not least because we had students and we had staff embedded within the schools. So even if we physically couldn't send people out from the university partners, there were people there who could engage and deliver quite easily. We also, I think, saw some fairly innovative stuff. Again, within our area, we have an organisation called Career Pilot, which is a collaborative activity across 20 universities in the southwest and south of England. And they were able to do a lot of one-to-one guidance activity using their professionally trained guidance staff. and that made a huge difference, I think, particularly for some year 13 students who were feeling somewhat at sea about the range of options available to them. And there was some good initiatives through partnership arrangements. So universities of Bath, Exeter and Cardiff have done quite a number of events working collaboratively online for schools and colleges within the South Wales and Southwest of England region. So I think there's been some very good stuff. I'd possibly contrast that maybe with what was happening with international activity, where there's been some really, really impressive collaborative work going on, and possibly it's because there are perceptions in senior university management about what matters, and certainly towards the back end of the last academic year, the concern about international student numbers, I think, meant that probably many universities were prepared to engage in an area that was historically seen as very competitive, whereas by comparison, access and participation has been always an area where you see ongoing competitiveness. One thing, of course, though, that we look or maybe concerned about is that the UniConnect hubs, of course, we still don't know the outcomes for the next round of funding. And I think as we move into possibly what could be an extended period of lockdown going forward, knowing where we stand with the UniConnect hubs is going to be quite critical for many universities in continuing to deliver that collaborative activity.
Message received and understood there, Mike. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Louise, a question for you. Given the impact on mental health and well-being, could you highlight any specific additional interventions around this area? So actually not just Louise, I think any of the panelists, but maybe Louise, we come to you first. And if others would also like to contribute to this question, I'd be very happy to hear from you as well.
Yeah, so when we were thinking particularly about the work on sense of belonging, we were conscious that there were some groups that were going to be disproportionately more affected by the way in which teaching and learning might be delivered this academic year, and the fact that isolation could certainly be a factor in exacerbating mental health for some students, or indeed introduce it for others. And so when we were looking at the design for the resources and the work on sense of belonging, one of the first key elements of that was to really ensure that colleagues understood that that was a risk factor, and also bring in that student dimension to it. So being able to share the feedback from students who talk about when they do feel like they belong and what does help them, and their mental health was really valuable, so that it was really coming from the perspective of the lived experiences of those students. But then also as well, being able to establish a strategy that meant that firstly, there was proactive steps to recognise that students would, I suppose, come forward to say that they were struggling more than others, but also a recognition that we also need to be quite proactive in identifying where there may be issues or challenges, was really helpful, and a push to ensure that we can support students as much as possible to be able to develop the the kinds of activities that will help your sense of belonging or your mental health if it's down to feeling isolated or lonely. So ways in which you can still connect with faith groups, and you can still connect with the Students' Union and make groups of friends, but also clear signposting to support should students need to access our disability services or counselling. So I think in summary, it was really raising awareness of it amongst staff, and then having clear steps in place to both mitigate the risks, but also to be able to address it should it arise.
Thanks, Louise. That's really, really helpful. Mike, did you want to come in as well?
Serendipity sometimes has a part to play in this sort of activity as well. For many years, the University of Bath has had students away from the university on placements and internships, and we've always been a bit concerned that those students maybe struggled to access the support at a distance. So we had been looking on the run up to the pandemic at having online counselling services in a variety of different languages. We also knew that with international students and various groups showing characteristics amongst our domestic students were less likely to engage in face-to-face counselling sessions, but would actually prefer to do them online. And we therefore managed to strike a deal just before the pandemic in having an online counselling service that we buy in support provision. Something else, and it was a very simple thing, but it turned out to be incredibly powerful. We had around about 650 students locked down on our campus during the pandemic. And the arrangements for feeding those students were that they were given three free meals a day, and they had to go and pick them up from one of our catering outlets. And to manage the queues, we had a number of senior staff turning out at each meal time to basically just be there for the hour that the students could pick up the food. And actually, I think in many cases, it provided an opportunity both for senior staff and for students to encounter each other and engage in discussions and express their concerns in a way that we never would have got from people having to do online polls or answer questionnaires. So sometimes that very individualised touch, and it was from the Vice-Chancellor down that this was going on, made quite a big difference at a period in time, I think, when people were feeling particularly isolated and spending an awful lot of time on their own and reflection. The final group who actually really stepped up in this period, in my view, were our Students' Union, who really took the bull by the horns, created a whole online campus community and range of activities to support both physical and mental well-being. And that sort of activity as well probably helped us because they were a more trusted group maybe than the university was seen by some students.
Thanks, Mike. That's really interesting. Ellen?
Yes, I mean, as I said, the Open University is a distance learning institution. So in a sense, it's an ongoing challenge for us to address how we engage with students across the board. And certainly that's how all of our systems and our processes and so on have evolved to that end. So our Students' Association, for example, is incredibly active online and has lots of groups available for students to interact with. We have from a large number of students with mental health issues, and we are very conscious in providing online resources for those students to be able to engage with. And I think there is also an awareness as well of how students behave online in not necessarily always, they might turn up, but they may not engage. That doesn't mean that they're not necessarily getting something from that experience. Some research that we did as part of our online careers forums at one point was that students were turning up and lurking, but not necessarily contributing. However, in the feedback, what they were able to tell us was that they had identified questions that they didn't know they needed to ask. And I think even just getting students engaged in that online space in the first instance, then therefore, as Louise was saying, it helps to engender that feeling of sense of belonging and community. And that's certainly something that we are still, looking to find the solutions to at the OU. I'm not suggesting that we have all of them at all, but certainly getting people as engaged as possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellen. Megan, did you want to say anything on this question?
I think Sarah, colleagues have already mentioned quite a lot of it, and I suppose similar to what Mike said, our student union really supported us as part of the mental health and raising students' awareness of the various avenues for support that they were able to access, and keeping that community going, and regularly holding forums with students and talking to students about how they were experiencing the online delivery, and basically just trying to keep a sense of belonging and community with all of our students. So again, I think to reiterate, the student union has been really, really supportive as part identifying those students and directing them to the appropriate support as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Megan. I think we may have time for just one more, and I do want to address it if I can. And the question is, what challenges do you see in effective evaluation of activity from March 2020? And I think this is particularly difficult in terms of some of the work that's been undertaken for outreach, for example, but I think it goes across the student life cycle. So I'm going to offer this out to any member of the panel who would like to comment.
Can I come in first?
Please
Sarah,
do, Megan. Yeah,
I mean,
do.
I think definitely there'll be challenges. If I'm honest, I think the access and participation plan was implicit in what we were doing with students, but not explicit. So when we were looking, when you go back and reflect, I think we have done some clear things that have spoken to and addressed the targets for the access and participation plan. However, in the forefront of our minds was absolutely just to try and engage with our students and keep them on track to succeed this year. So I think, you know, the challenges will be reflecting on that and the impact that has had during this time, really, and how that then translates into reporting on that.
Thanks, Megan. I'm very conscious of time, so Mike, we've got about a minute or so left. So if you could sort of very quickly.
I think the key thing is going to be we've got to recognise schools and colleges probably don't have the capacity to give us stuff this year, so we're going to have to design that in ourselves, and if we can't, then we're going to need to be able to explain why that wasn't possible. But you know, the schools really are pressed for time and resource at the moment. We need to recognise that. Okay,
thanks, Mike. Ellen.
Yes, I think for me, from the progression perspective, it's helping students, the challenge of helping students keep pace with the changes in the labour market, because I don't think any of us really know exactly what's going to happen in that space. And for them, in planning their careers, understanding what the implications might be for them, whether that be from, I think somebody put something up about, you know, arts students who may be particularly affected within that sector, but also helping students rethink potentially where they might go and what skills they already have to offer, and what areas that might enable them to kind of look at as well, and being realistic in that space too.
Okay, I'm sorry, Louise, I don't have time to come to you on this question. I'm really sorry, because I do have to wrap the event up. But I would like to thank all of you for your contribution to the session today. It's been very, very interesting to hear the different challenges that you've faced and the different ways in which you've addressed those challenges. So thank you very much for sharing that with us and with the delegates this afternoon. Thanks also to Chris and Elizabeth for the opening session. I hope you have got quite a lot out of this session. Obviously, as Elizabeth said, we will be writing to you towards the end of this month with further guidance around the 2019-2020 monitoring of access and participation plans. But in the interim, I do hope that you, your colleagues, your students all stay safe. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. So I'll sign off there, and thank you very much, all of you, for attending and listening to this today.